So in chapter 7, God seals his people and they're standing like an army ready for battle. Well, in chapter 8, we see what this army is supposed to do. And actually, their action should be surprising because they don't pick up the sword. They don't actually fight in any way. What they do is offer up their prayers and allow God to be God. And so we're seeing the unleashing of God's judgment, of his purpose and will on the earth, and our role in that as God's holy people who are supposed to be praying and being a part of this whole endeavor. Revelation 8, 2 through 13. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel came and stood at the altar and held a gold bowl for burning incense. He was given a large amount of incense in order to offer it on behalf of the prayers of all the saints on the gold altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense offered for the prayers of the saints rose up before God from the angel's hands. Then the angel took the incense container and filled it with fire from the altar. He threw it down to the earth, and there was thunder, voices, lightning, and an earthquake. Then the 7 angels who held the 7 trumpets got ready to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and hail and fire mixed with blood appeared and was thrown down to the earth. A third of the earth was burned up. A third of the trees were burned up. All the green grass was burned up. Then the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain burning with fire was thrown down to the sea. A third of the sea became blood, a third of the creatures living in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Then the third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star burning like a torch fell from heaven. It fell on a third of the rivers and springs of water. The star's name is wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood. And so many people died from the water because it became so bitter. Then the fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them became dark. The day lost a third of its light, and the night lost a third of its light too. Then I looked, and I heard an angel flying high overhead. It said with a loud voice, "Horror, horror, oh, the horror for those who live on earth because of the blasts of the remaining trumpets and the 3 angels are about to blow." A reminder of the context really quick. So let's look back just from Revelation 6, 7, and now we're in chapter 8. And there's a lot more. There's so many layers upon layers throughout all of these images. But in chapter 6 in particular, let's look down at verse 10, for instance. We saw the altar already up in heaven, and we saw under the altar were the saints, those who had been killed for their faith, and they're crying out day and night, "How long? How long until God brings judgment and justice against their attackers?" And significantly, the way that they are described in chapter 6, verse 10, is those who live on earth. This is in contrast, even though we might be physically on earth, our citizenship is in heaven, versus those whose citizenship is of the earth. And so it's those who live on the earth, who dwell on the earth, who are the ones who are attacking the saints of God. And these saints are crying out day and night, "When will you bring judgment and justice against us, against our attackers, Lord?" And God gives them the answer, "Wait until the full number of your brothers and sisters comes in." And so then what do we see, especially in chapter 7, is exactly that, the full number of God's people being sealed. And once more, I'm of the mind that the 144,000 is the multitude that represents all of God's people throughout all of time. And so it flows really nicely from the sequence of the saints who have been killed, crying out for justice. God says, "Wait until the full number of my people have been sealed," and then that happens. And now coming into chapter 8, we're seeing the next phase of judgment, of crying out, and we see a lot of these images pop up again. And so we have the altar, and earlier in Revelation we saw that the incense of God were the prayers of the saints that were kind of wafting up into God's presence. And so that's the image of in the temple you would have like a bowl. It's called a censer, and you would put the incense in there and burn it, and the smoke was seen as a symbolic representation of the prayers of God's people. And so here we see it again. It's the saints praying with the altar, and all of their prayers are going up before God. And it's this kind of important interlude before unleashing some of these judgments against the earth. And so we have the altar, the incense, the prayers, and the angel takes these prayers and then fills that same container with fire from the altar and throws it down to the earth. So this whole scene, it's kind of like an important parenthesis, because you have the 7 angels who stand before the throne of God with 7 trumpets, and then verse 3 through verse 5 is like a parenthesis. Now let's look over here really quick, and there's all these prayers happening, and then the prayers seem to be the catalyst for God throwing down these judgments on the earth, and then the 7 angels begin to blow. Now we don't have time to go through every one. These are fascinating images, and you can really dig a lot out of these. 2 key Old Testament references to understand what these trumpet blasts are all about. The first one, I think probably the biggest one, is from Exodus. If you read 7 through 10 especially, these are all the plagues of Egypt. So God's people were in Egypt under this oppressive empire in slavery, and God is rescuing them from Egypt. And the way he's doing that is by bringing judgment against Pharaoh and against the gods of Egypt through these plagues. And these are paralleled here. Almost the same plagues show up in different form, maybe in different sequence, but you have the hail and the sea turning to blood, and animals dying, and all of these things are happening over and over and over again. So Exodus is a key reference point. John is essentially telling us that the plagues that rescued God's people, that brought judgment against God's enemies, are happening again. And then the other big one would be probably Joshua, chapter 6. This is the famous story of the fall of Jericho, with the 7 days of marching and the trumpet blasts. And so these seven trumpets would have recalled this image of the 7 blasts of the trumpet that were both a sign of the coming judgment and then actually enacted the final judgment. The 7th trumpet brought down the walls of Jericho. And so you have some of this going on in the background here. And again, there's so many more things you could pull out with all the different specific images. But just a quick note that ask some questions about this in the show notes. I'll put some, as always, plenty of references in the show notes themselves. But this image of the star who has a name, who comes down and actually enacts some of this judgment. We've already seen that stars equal apparently the angels, right? At the end of Revelation 1, and then all of chapter 2 and 3, each church apparently has a guardian angel assigned for it. So there's this idea in Revelation that the people of God we're not just here on earth by ourselves. We have heavenly counterparts. We have these spiritual beings watching out for us, guarding us. Well, the wicked nations of the world also have their own spiritual beings. And so here the star, we might say, is a stand-in not for the righteous heavenly beings that are watching out for the church, but for the wicked spiritual beings that are kind of guiding and influencing the wicked nations. And so this may come up again, but this idea that the star itself is being judged, cast down to the earth. You might want to look at Isaiah 14, for instance, for one reference for all of that. So then we haven't even gotten through all of the trumpets, but the trumpets are blowing, catalyzed by the prayers of the saints. The judgment against the enemies of God are being thrown down to the earth. And then we see this final refrain from the chapter: horror, horror for those who live on the earth because of the blast of the remaining trumpets. So these are just the precursor. And as we've seen, so the saints under the altar are crying out, how long until you bring judgment against those who live on the earth, because they've done all of these terrible persecutions against God's people. And then the eagle says, horror for those who live on the earth. And it's the exact same phrase here, because the remaining judgment is still to come. And so we have kind of comes full circle, where now the judgment is really being unleashed on the earth. And God is both sealing his people and protecting them in the midst of these trials. They're not fully absent from it, but God is ultimately bringing judgment against the rebellious and against the spiritual forces of evil in the world.